Good afternoon, guests. My name is Raza Latif. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's 12 o'clock, so we're going to get started. I know people are trickling in. Um, so on the East Coast, this is lunchtime, so thank you for sharing your lunchtime with us. Please feel free to eat, have a cup of coffee, or feel relaxed. I mean, this is a conversation that I'm sure you will enjoy. In fact, it might get a little contentious, so maybe bring some popcorn. Once again, my name is Raza Latif. I'm the CEO here at NuAxis. Before we get into the conversation, I just wanted to kind of give a background, and then I will go ahead and introduce the panelists and our moderator. So if you have been following us on social media, as well as if you've looked at our website, we have been very gung-ho about this discipline of customer experience and human-centered design. We are traditionally an infrastructure company. So while we are so enthusiastic about CX and human-centered design, we really understand that security is something very critical to our lives at the moment. And as we started many years ago, as we started kind of working on this capability around CX and human-centered design, we would always find that there was a conflict between experience and security. And we have always navigated that to the best of our abilities. And today the conversation is going to be just about that. And I wanted to share with you some of my personal stories of why CX and human-centered design matters so much to me and to our company. So I myself feel very strongly, and I'm sure many of my colleagues agree, that the role of government is extremely critical. It's not just a nice to have entity in our society. It's something that really has critical, life-changing impact on people's lives. And I'm a product of that. If I look at my life over the last so many decades, I'm a product of the 8A program. I'm a product of the small business program. The fact that we have been able to build a company that's well known in our industry and consists of some amazing people is because the government at some point said we're going to have a program called an 8A program, which will allow disadvantaged minorities to be able to set up a business. So that's the critical path that's the critical impact that I'm talking about that the federal government has. Another story I would like to share quickly is that about 15 years ago, my mother-in-law, who lives with us, had a rash on her leg, which we didn't know what it was. She had no insurance. She had no idea what was going on. We took her to the ER, and this is a time when I'm in grad school while working. This is a time when we are pregnant with our first baby. And my mother-in-law has this thing. We take her to the hospital, and they say it's MRSA. MRSA, if you recall, is something that was one of the most infectious things that was around at that time. And she had to be quarantined for like 2 weeks in the hospital. Obviously, my wife couldn't see her because she was pregnant. I was in grad school, so on and so forth. Long story short, she comes back home fully cured, and a few days later we get a bill for $18,000. Having landed fresh off the board, I'm still fresh off the board, but less fresh than I was at that time. There was no way on earth that we could have paid that bill, and I was literally wanted to tell my wife, let's pack up our bags and go home. At that time, home was not where I am. So I went to the hospital the next day, half crying, and I told them that, we've gotten this bill and what are we going to do with it? Oh, they said, oh, it's not a problem. Your mother-in-law is at a certain age, whatever, call this number and they will take care of this bill. And you know what? I did. And within a few days, that bill was taken care of. Once again, a government agency got involved and literally changed the path of my life. I would have been in a different circumstance if that agency did not intervene at that point. So what I'm trying to kind of show with these stories is that the government has a critical role to play and has almost earth-shattering impact on the lives of people. Our government has all kinds of areas of improvement, which like any other entity, but the role that it has, and when it does that, when it does its job well, it really changes lives for the better. So why is CX so critical? The fact that the government is not really catching up with the ways of the world, where the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons of the world are providing this amazing experience, the federal government is now getting less and less involved in the lives of our citizens. And that, I think, is a risk that we are not willing to live with. So we as a company are really dedicated to making sure that our federal government embraces the discipline of CX and human-centered design so that it remains relevant and continues to provide the impact that it's designed to provide as part of our society. So that's kind of the background on why we are so excited about CX and human-centered design, especially when it comes to our federal government. So as you know, that the topic of the day is that CX is from Venus or Mars, and security is from the other planet. I don't want to associate one with the other, but as this was a book that was written many years ago, as you recall, where we talked about men are from Venus or women are from Venus, or I never can get that right. But the idea is that, yes, we are from different planets and there are different priorities for CX and security, but we need to coexist, just like we do as men and women. We need to coexist and we need to thrive and we need to continue to do the things that need to happen. And that's pretty much the topic of the day. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that will follow. If you could go to the next slide, please. So we've invited our very dear friend of the company, Martha Dorris, who's going to be our moderator. Martha is also sometimes known as the CX gal. She's also the godmother of CX. Martha is a retired senior executive out of GSA who has really been a pioneer in the space of CX for the federal government. So she will be moderating today. One of our panelists who's here is Venus, Amanda Chavez is our VP of Customer Experience. Amanda is a force to be reckoned with in the company. She's somebody who's really helped us as a group, as a company, to really embrace and learn CX. Amanda has an amazing background where she actually helped one of the large companies in our area, in our federal government consulting area, really set up a human-centered design and CX practice. So a lot of expertise here on the CX side, and on the left, which is Mars, is Rich Zanatta. Rich is our VP of Operations as well as our CTO. Rich is another veteran, of our federal industry. Rich has actually run the data center for the House of Representatives. Rich has been on Air Force One, running the infrastructure for Air Force One. So you can imagine that Rich is somebody who's very is a SME when it comes to security of infrastructure. And last but not least, Rich has actually run a deli in New York City. So all kinds of security you can imagine Rich is very good at. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Martha to kick us off, and let's do this, Martha.
Thank you, Raza. It's really a privilege for me to be here today to talk about these two disciplines and how they can work together. It really is a new paradigm today, talking about customer experience and security. If you think about it, any breach in security impacts the public or the employees. So if you have, we had the big OPM breach, and everybody who was connected with that or connected to somebody who was connected, the impact really trickled down quite a bit. The government is really important in our daily lives as well as important times in our lives, based, as you kind of described in the story that you had. And in many cases, when you're working with the government or you need the government, it's at a vulnerable time in your life and you don't have time to think about, or you don't have time to have a bad experience. And so that's sometimes, when you have an issue with security or setting your password or things like that. So it's really one of the reasons why these two areas need to work together. But before we get started, I want to set the stage. And if you think about it, we have the President's Management Agenda, which really looks at empowering the workforce, improving customer experience and transforming services, and also building the the business of government to build back better, or managing the business of government. And all three of those areas within the president's management agenda, both customer experience and the discipline of customer experience and security, play an important role in all three of those areas. We also have the executive order, both on cybersecurity and customer experience. And customer experience EO talks about delivering an excellent, equitable, and secure services to the public. And so it has both the CX flavor and the security flavor right in the beginning of it. So it really, people are bringing them together, even though it's not talked about a lot together. So it's an important conversation that we're going to have today. Both the federal CIO, Claire Mortarana, and Krista Ruscia, the federal CISO, obviously the CISO security is a very important, his priority, but he also has been quoted to say every security team needs to bring a customer experience person into the team so that those kind of considerations are included. And customer experience and cybersecurity are the top two priorities by the federal CIO. So today we're going to talk about the conflict between the two areas. We're going to learn about exactly what cybersecurity or security and customer experience are, the challenges or the mysteries and misnomers of both. And then we're going to have Amanda and Rich are going to give us some case studies that really show how these two disciplines work together. But hopefully by the end of the conversation today, you're actually going to learn that there's more things that they have in common than not. So with that, let's get this party started. Next slide. So we have the debate. If you want to mention also, if you have any questions, please include them in the chat, and we'll take them possibly in the middle if it's relevant, or take them at the end. Next slide. So cybersecurity and CX are really two sides of the same coin. So we're going to meet Mars first, and I'm going to turn it over to Rich.
Thanks, Martha. So I think everybody that probably is on the call know what cybersecurity is all about and information security is all about. It's about protecting our digital assets, our critical infrastructure, our resources that deliver services to everybody in the country. And it doesn't matter if you're providing government services or you're providing electrical power or water. All of this infrastructure needs to be protected and secured by and defensed against those, the bad actors, the nation states and others that are out there trying to exploit our systems and capabilities.
Thanks, Rich. And I think it's really interesting that you brought up all of these various areas. I mean, if you think about healthcare, energy, financial areas, all of those are really, security is such an important piece of it. Next slide. And now we're going to meet Venus. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Martha. So for those of you who don't know what customer experience is, it's helpful to maybe decouple it from what people, I think I hear a lot of people assume that CX is. So it's not UX, it's not user experience, although they're very close cousins. User experience, UX, is about how a singular touch point, how you interact with a singular touch point, how it looks or feels. CX is broader than that. So if you think about, because I'm going to try to court Mars in this example, just to bring us together here. But Rich is a veteran. So if you think about veteran affairs as an example, of multiple touch points, right? How do you even find out that you have services? That's one touch point, right? When you're in the TAP program and you're separating from service, you'll hear about the ways to get in touch with Veterans Affairs. That's one touch point. Then, when you need to use services from Veterans Affairs, there's different channels for you to get in touch with VA, right? You can go through a website. There's, the My Healthy Vet app. You can call an organization. Then there's the experience that you have when you actually physically go to a VA facility. all of those, the composite of all of those constitutes the end-to-end customer experience that you have. And that's what CX aims to do, is to try to unify that experience, streamline it, and make it so that it's seamless for you, right? So that you don't have to do what Raza did and call and chase people down, right, to get what you need, but that it's a seamless experience for you. And I think it's also worth mentioning here too, speaking of things that CX is not, I think it also gets confused a lot with customer service. So again, CX is the totality of your experience with those touch points for an organization, and customer service is the support that you get, when you're using a product or a service. So they're separate in that way.
Thanks, Amanda. I think the conversation about customer experience, user experience, customer service is a really important one, because there is so many misnomers, even within the federal government at pretty high levels and on the industry side as well. And so I try to think of it as, when the customer, is it a citizen, is it a business, is it an employee, when they have a problem to solve, what is that journey from the time they have a problem to solve through that entire journey until even past the time that the problem is solved? And a lot of the issues come up in the handoffs between channels, right? So you can have a good experience in channel by channel by channel, but the overall experience is not a good one. So hopefully we've explained that well. So let's dive in. So what are security and customer experience really trying to accomplish? Rich, let's go with the security side first.
Well, as we said in the beginning, it's about securing the infrastructure, maintaining what the customer is doing. Actually, I think the best word to use here is protecting a customer and the users against themselves. So we're providing an envelope that whatever they're doing online, on a computer, on a mobile device, is secure. Whether we're encrypting the traffic, we're making sure that their passwords are encrypted, they're using multi-factor authentication, and enabling them to do what they need to do, but to make sure that that experience or the things that they're doing in that environment is secure. They're not just, and I can use my dad in this example. He was notorious for going out and going to the same website and downloading viruses and downloading things that do bad things on his computer. So, protecting the user against themselves from doing harm to their infrastructure, their capabilities, and then protecting the organization, so who we work for, making sure that data isn't compromised and infrastructure isn't compromised.
I think Martha might be frozen.
Looks like it.
All right.
Over to you, Venus.
Thank you, Mars. So, Rich mentioned, trying to save the customer from his or herself. I can relate to that. I'm probably the customer Rich is referring to in that scenario. But, when you're talking about things like VPNs or multi-factor authentication, right? Some of those things from the CX point of view are, we understand that they're necessary. And, we're thinking about how people can get through their experience as seamlessly as possible. And in the example of a VPN or, multi-factor authentication, you know what I mean? But, when you're going through those different security measures, it can slow down your ability to have that seamless interaction. So that's what we're thinking about from a CX point of view. We're trying to make things as seamless as possible. And sometimes that seems incongruent and incompatible with security.
Am I back? Can you
You're
hear me?
back. Yes.
Sorry.
Welcome, Martha.
I guess that's a good thing about practicing, right? You kind of know what's coming next. As you're both talking, to me, it really is very simple. And you can pull both of these threads into the trust that your customers have in your organization? And when we say customers, again, we're talking about, is it the public that has trust in your organization and your agency? Is it your employees that have trust in the systems that you're using to manage the internal processes with them? Is it the business, community that's trying to do business with the government? And when you think about the security, obviously, you want to make sure that everything is secure. When you talk about the experience, you want to make sure that that all leads to better services, leads to improved trust in government. So I'm gonna kind of bring it all down to like that one thing. Okay, next slide. So, we're starting to already identify that we have common goals around customer experience and security, yet security and customer experience don't really work together not that they don't work together well when they actually do work together. It's just that they don't really think about the other person or the other organization or the other discipline. Rich, why do security people and organizations try to avoid the CX organization?
I'm not sure if the word is avoid. It's more it's time to market, I think. So when you have a large constituency that you've got to support, we've got to be quick. We've got to be nimble. And when we're dealing with security issues, whether we're migrating a user community over from a single factor authentication to a multi-factor, or deploying new antivirus or new VPN technologies, it's got to be done quickly. It's got to be done efficiently. In reaching out to a large group of people in any way, shape, or form can slow that process down, and it really hinders the process at that time of making sure that the infrastructure is secure.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that we'll go to Amanda and then kind of pull them all together. Amanda?
Sure. So, I think CX folks, I'll just speak for myself. I can say probably prior, to coming to this organization and working so closely with Rich, I know that I have one of my old colleagues here from my Booz Allen days. I know that one of my friends is here, so I know that he knows what I'm talking about when I say this. But it wasn't something at the beginning of my career that I was thinking about. I wasn't, as a CX practitioner, I wasn't thinking about security. And that's sort of, that's a gap for CX professionals. A lot of us are thinking so much about the customer. We're not thinking about the technical backend. We're not thinking about technical debt. And we're certainly not thinking about security. Because oftentimes too, those are two different organizations. They can exist in silos. And it's two different mindsets also, because security very often owns the technology. And so, you've got to spend some time trying to convince them that this is, something that's worth investing in.
Yeah, it seems like that in reality, security needs CX and CX needs security, because if the security doesn't work and you're like retrofitting it at the end, and then the security is kind of over-engineered, in terms of passwords or other ways to access systems, then you start thinking about the CX side of it. So it's like, okay, this is kind of a good reminder of how both of these groups and these disciplines need to think about things early on and work together. Next slide. I think we talked a little bit about this, but what are the ramifications or the drawbacks of the security and the CX teams not working together or avoiding each other? Rich?
Well, I think the big drawback, obviously, and you've already stated that, is that we're not having that interaction with the customer, and I hate to say it, it still has to be that time to market. We've got to get the word out that things are changing. That's important, but day-to-day operations comes first. Day-to-day security of the infrastructure has to come first. Slowing that down and slowing down deployments could be a detriment to an organization. It could be, you could leave one person out in the cold that his or her password is compromised. And again, we're really
Thanks, Rich. Over to Venus.
So, a lot of times when, CX is coming in, if we're lucky enough to get in at the front end when these things are happening, when you're doing the user research, mapping out the journeys, going over the personas, and then designing a solution, if you do that in a vacuum, and this would go not just for security, but with, technology in general, if you're doing that in a vacuum and siloing yourself, you're going to make something that potentially can't be used because it's not secure. And it's certainly not going to make it into production. So that's going to cause, your organization or your customers a lot of, spent resources of time and money that you can't get back because you didn't involve the right people at the front end. So that's a huge drawback that I think, I've certainly seen many times.
I think while that's a drawback, and not to bump into there for a second, while that is a drawback, so building and architecting a system, a solution, I'm all for including people in that. But at the same point in time, a system is only as secure as when you turn it on. It evolves and changes too quickly. The bad actors that are out there, the nation states that are exploiting and trying to infiltrate our infrastructure, they've got tools and resources that are just beyond approach. So yeah, I can architect a really, really solid solution, and I can go back to when I date myself, when Windows NT first came out, and we were asked to put it on a network when I worked out in Space Command. The rule of thumb is the only secure NT system and one that wasn't turned on and wasn't plugged into anything. So that's secure. As soon as you plug it into the network and you're starting to do things with it, it's vulnerable. It can be attacked in some way, shape, or form. So, and that's the job of the people that are out there. Their job is to find ways to exploit these systems. So yes, we can build a secure system. We can include everybody's opinion in it. But at the end of the day, when we turn the switch on, it's people are going to be attacking it in some way, shape, or form. Their job is to find that little tiny piece of the puzzle that they can exploit.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time to touch on the fact that neither security or customer experience are easy, right? Like security, when we're talking about the passwords and the front end pieces of it, you're right, Rich. I mean, you think about vulnerabilities that we've had in the country and, pipelines and banks and, the energy sector and the financial sector. I mean, it is a huge big deal. And I think people get, focused on the importance of it and how critical it is to national security in terms of locking things down and securing them. And then on customer experience, I mean, we gave you a very, quick definition of it, but, it involves how decisions are made in agencies and how do you bring the users into all the systems in terms of human-centered design, and how do you set metrics and how do you monitor things. And so both of these are much bigger disciplines than we're really talking about. And I was going to give you the example when I was at GSA and I had like an infrastructure organization for USA.gov, and then we had the content team for USA.gov. And you have very different people and very different mindsets working in the technology side than you do on the content side. And so we had people that, wanted things to move really quickly on one side and people that wanted to make sure that everything was really tested and locked down on the other side. And it was just a constant battle between these two organizations about how fast we could really do things. And on the content side, we'd be like, this is a public website. All of this information is publicly available. What is the worst thing that could happen? And we used to say, if we get a denial of service and somebody brings down that website, it is the front door to the federal government and to this country, and it would be a big deal. Or if you turned on your computer one day and Putin's face was on there as opposed to the USA.gov stuff, it sends a signal to the world, right, on how secure things are. So both of these are really, really important to at least bring everything to the table and talk about it together. So great conversation. Let's go to the next slide. Do we really need each other, Rich?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we need each other. I think, I was trying to think of an analogy.
Did I hear you say we need each other?
Yeah, sometimes. But I think there's a disconnect, not that there's a disconnect. And I think if you look at it from from a metaphorical standpoint, security and CX are like a train track. So, there are two significant pieces of a train track, the rails. They never touch each other. They run parallel to each other, the full length of the train system, but they never really intersect. And I think there's where the problem might lie is, do we need to have outreach and conversations with customers when it comes to specific security things? Probably we do. It's that. And I think where we see pushback from the industry is that, and I don't think we can do a show of hands, but, how many people who are on the webinar with us today hear pushback when, we do our annual security training. I've got to take my, the crappy security training, it's the same thing as last year, but it's really not because it continues to evolve. Thank you. But those are the things that, we do need each other in some way, shape, or form. And how do we get those words out to the people that are, need to take the training? How to enable people to understand what's going on, and how to enable them to understand what security is really doing on the back end to protect them?
Well, and security, so much of the vulnerability is in your own employees, right? And you mentioned training, but in your own employees and the stickies around the computers with all the passwords on it. So, or places where people can crack the code on even just passwords. What do you think? Do we really need each other?
So for anybody who knows me, of course we need each other. So, security, I think almost everybody probably in the room here and at large understands that security is necessary for all of the reasons that you have pointed out prior to this. But having CX added to it, and see, this is how much I am not going to fight Mars. I'm not going to fight you on this. I'm going to tee you up nicely for your case story, Rich, because CX is really important too, not just for, people adopting your technology and finding it seamless, but Rich is going to talk about it, about how this will adding CX helps to make the experience equitable in terms of getting accessibility going throughout an organization. So absolutely, they have to go together.
Yeah, great point about, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of like trust in government and the drive with the PMA and with the executive order, we're really driving to more digital services, right? And so
Absolutely.
The more digital services that you are enabling at all different levels, the more vulnerabilities that are created and the more that these two disciplines really need to work together. So it just seems inevitable, right? Next slide. So Amanda teed up one of the case studies, and it's interesting to see from different aspects, because I think we do tend to think about security from one lens versus another. So Rich, why don't we go with the first case study?
Sure. Can we go to the next slide?
Next slide.
So this case study looks at enabling accessibility through secure CX. So we just go right to the next slide. So one of our customers and our service desk members were working with a customer in an environment, and this particular individual had a lot of issues operating and functioning within the environment that he was in, and it had to deal with the accessibility tools that he had on his computer. So the individual was visually impaired, and for those who have to have dealt with that, you've got to have screen readers, you've got to have software that's running on your computer that allows you to really be functional and operating and being productive in your environment. So we really didn't have a great understanding of what the screen reading tools were doing to the computer when they were enabled and enacted and the person was using them. But we did find as this went on, it reduced this person's functionality even more significantly than we actually anticipated. We did have conversations with his management team and the infrastructure team that he basically really wasn't functional for a long period of time. And I think it was a period of like 6 years when he started that, he was really not doing what he should be doing. Let's run to the next slide. So our secure but mission impacting. So as we looked at this environment, we started to do what most IT people do. We threw processor and memory at it. We replaced the computer. We made sure the operating system was tuned appropriately. We did all of the typical things that good IT people do. If you can't throw processor and memory at it, it's not our problem. But we started to dig deeper into the problem. We started to look at the actual operations and the features and functions that were going on. We started to understand by conversations with the customer on what he was experiencing, when he was experiencing it, and then started to look at the system holistically and see what exactly was happening in that environment, so we can figure out how we can fix the problem. And I don't have the other slides. So resolution. So as we went through this, we looked at what the resources were, what processes were being hit. And then what we found was every time the screen reading software, and to be nameless, we don't want to throw anybody under the bus, and it wasn't their problem. Every time the software was kicked off, it spawned antivirus scans. And it wasn't the antivirus scan's fault either. It's just the way the system was configured. But every time those two things interacted, it would peg the CPU and it'd chew up as much memory as possible to make the system pretty much unusable or unusable, screen lock it. And then, obviously the person who was using those capabilities, they had to sit and wait. They had to see what was going to happen next. So what we did, and we can go to the next slide. So this is your slide, Amanda. I'm sorry. We can go back up one more. Sorry. So what we did is we worked with our security team between the service desk, the security team, and after we identified that it was the antivirus causing this issue, we did an exception for scanning on those files, and it was some particular DLLs that were being really seriously impacted. So as we did this deviation and we deployed it, we found that the problem that this individual was happening to him was gone. So we made him functional, made him operational. So it was a minor tweak, and I hate to call it a minor tweak, but it was a change to the way the antivirus worked on the system, which allowed this customer to be fully functional and fully operational and move forward, being able to complete his mission. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you. It's so weird when you call me Amanda now. I was actually getting really used to Venus. Thank you. It's everybody from NuAxis. Please take note. But so what Rich said was, maybe at the time they weren't thinking about, CX per se, but what Rich's team did enabled a great customer experience. And by using some of the tools, by going into that customer's day-to-day, what his workflows looked like, the fact that he wasn't able to be, active in his computer and accomplish the mission, they were looking at his journey. And then through that journey, looking at the pain points, they were able to test different solutions, right? Iteratively test different solutions, and were able to come up with one that made our customer here more productive, right? And I mean, I know that we're talking about it sort of at a high level, but imagine what it must feel like to not be able to do your job. You might be worried about, how your manager is looking at you. You might feel, like you're not adding value in your day-to-day. That's probably very, very stressful. So, having this person become more productive is not a small thing. But in terms of, what this did for the organization too, it reduced service calls to the help desk, right? Because this person was not able to get in for a period of years, or not able to successfully navigate his system for a number of years. So all of that resulted in a lot of help desk calls that were reduced as a result. And something else that Rich and his team did was that once they found what was happening for this one visually impaired person, they were able to share that knowledge of how this was impacting that sort of edge case, and share that broadly within the team, and scale the solution across similar personas within the organization. And I would say that, this is an organization-specific example, but you could apply this process and sort of these takeaways broadly across multiple contracts as well. And so next slide, please. So some of the takeaways from Rich's story, are that you really have to, no matter where you're sitting, if you're sitting on the technology side or sitting on the CX side, it's really worth it to go in and look at the customer's journey and think about what pain points are prohibiting people from being able to fulfill their mission. And then digging deeper into those workflows, and also the experience that the person is having too. It adds a sense of urgency, and it also adds context to look at their experience in addition to the workflows. And then again, taking that edge case, they were able to scale that solution from the one to the many. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Amanda. Just to kind of close this out as well. To me, when you guys were describing this, there's a couple things also to highlight around. It's very difficult to capture the ROI of customer experience in an agency. You've got, the way things are funded, things are so split apart. So sometimes it's difficult to actually capture that. But when you talked about, people are more productive, it reduces calls to your help desk. In other situations, it could, when you don't just automatically initially throw technology at it to hopefully solve the problem. And I was really trying to think of a good example, around just a practical everyday example of a problem in your life, and you just kept spending money on it when you didn't take a step back and kind of look at what's the root cause of the problem, not just trying to fix it like that.
Yep.
Again, capturing what those benefits are, to not only in the dollars and cents, but also, like you mentioned, to the user and the engagement of employees, and how much more the government is going to get out of employees when they're engaged, versus the technology that they use really doesn't enable them to be productive, and it doesn't make them feel good about what they do every day. And then lastly, I'm sure when you have disabilities like that, you're always a little bit vulnerable, as well. And so just helping with the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, this is really a good example of how this kind of solution can help in the accessibility space. So just to pull it together.
That's such a great point, Martha. And if I can just add on to that too, that last point that you mentioned about, folks who are impacted with different disabilities, we've done research on that across a number of different organizations that we have contracts with. And every time we have interviewed some of our folks with those different impairments, that what you said is exactly right. Some of the people that we've spoken to have talked about like not wanting to draw attention to themselves or the disability that they're working with, also not be a squeaky wheel. So they don't want to have attention drawn to that. So I think that's any solution that you can come up with that helps people just embed within their organizations and accomplish their mission. I second that, Martha.
Yeah, and the aging population too, right? Like it seems like there's going to be more and more applicability for these kinds of solutions going forward. So kudos to you, Rich, for digging into it and figuring out what it was, and it's something that can be, like Amanda mentioned, scaled across agency, organizations and agencies and the government. So let's hear about the next case study.
So the next case study, scaling secure CX. So this is a little bit of a departure. So typically, and we can go to the next slide, typically when we talk about CX, we're talking about the end customer, the person who's out in the field using the mobile device, the laptop, and things of that nature. So our approach on this one, and we successfully did this at one of our customers, is that while we were building systems, and I wasn't the guy building the systems, I was leading the team who was, as we did this work, we created a process, an interview process, where we were obviously collecting requirements and understanding what was going on for the people who want the system built. But we took it a step further. So we included the product owners, the systems owner, system owner, and security in this process. So we're talking about the genesis of DevSecOps. So what we were doing at this point in time was that instead of just viewing that person at the end of the laptop or a mobile device as the customer, we viewed all of these people internally as ourselves, or for ourselves as our customers as well. So we provided them the same benefits and same understanding of what was going on in the infrastructure. So as we did this, we started to build systems and capabilities, and we were able to streamline this process instead of going through and alienating security and just throwing the server over to them when we thought it was ready for a security scan before production. We included them in the process. The system owners and product owners, we included them in the process. We let them know what we were doing as the process was evolving, and as we created the server, using their input, knowing what the application was going to do, if it was a single tier, which we don't field, multi-tier architectures, but looking at all of those aspects to make sure that we were putting it together right. So a little bit of a shift, because we're not looking at that end customer anymore. We're looking at our internal customers to make sure that we're meeting their needs and their concerns. So we can go to the next slide. So we're, again, and I blending this together. So it's putting all of these pieces of the puzzle in light. So as we went through this, we would build a system with the understanding of what the application is going to do, understanding their security requirements, and from a government standpoint, is it FISMA low, moderate, or high? Is it going to sit in a cloud environment? Which cloud environment does it need to sit into, and where is it going to reside? What is all the functionality behind it? But more importantly, looking at it from when we built the system, from step one. What's the operating system going to be? What security controls need to be in place? And the typical approach on this is and I think we can go to the next slide. We harden the system. Yeah, we can pop on. I think I hit these already, unfortunately. Go ahead, go to the next slide. Next one, there you go. So back one, too many. So as we go through this process where, we're co-creating with the ability to make sure that the systems are going to be basically sitting the CIA mantra, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we deploy the STIGs. We make sure that when whatever the operating system is, that what we do and how we build the system, we're hitting all the things that need to be done. We then toss that system over the fence to our buddies in security, and we allow them to do a base security scan. When we get that scan back, we go through, and our system engineers and our administrators, they go through and they take out all of the vulnerabilities. They remediate those vulnerabilities, the criticals, highs, mediums, and we try to conquer most of the lows as possible, but sometimes there's too many of those. And we take and make sure that the system is as hardened as possible through the STIG, and making sure that all those vulnerabilities are taken care of. So after that, we go through the next step in this, and we start deploying the application piece, whether this is something that's homegrown, developed, or we're deploying a COTS product. We're deploying that, and we're going through that exact same process now. But in these steps, we're including the product owners and system owners and functional owners, so they know what we're doing and when we're doing it, and more importantly, why we're doing it. So at this point, we're still applying the application. working with them to make sure that the application is deployed, deploying whatever STIGs may be appropriate for that particular application, and then again going back and scanning the system again as we've added more code and more infrastructure or products into the system. We need to go back in and make sure that there are no known vulnerabilities that might be associated with the tools that were just deployed or the application that's just deployed. And again, we do the exact same thing. We make sure that we're hardened and get rid of the criticals, the highs and mediums, address the lows, make sure that the right TCP ports and UDP ports are turned on or off, and then again, go back through another scan, make sure everything is done and it's hardened to the fullest extent possible. So keeping all these people in the loop, it actually makes a better, not so much customer experience, but employee experience. So now you're interacting with your employees who interact with other employees who are potentially providing services to your customers. So what they're doing on the back end is going to come back out on the front end. So all of that's resonating with them. So at the end of the day, we deliver a hardened capability. That's good when it gets turned on, and then we have to maintain it and sustain that architecture.
And so I don't know about anybody else, but when I hear a technologist speaking the words of CX, I don't know, it warms the cockles of my heart. So Rich is exactly right. When we talk about CX, we're thinking a lot about the customer experience. But in this example, security and CX worked together on the back end to make sure that the server was deployed, monitored, and sustained with the customer first, right? By talking to them at the very beginning of this, including and co-creating with them, we're able to get something that meets the internal customer's needs. So that exactly like Rich said, so that they can go on and better serve their customers. And so I think it's also worth mentioning here too, that when we hear about CX or human-centered design, we're thinking about like really sexy things, right? Like Apple uses it as part of their process, right? Airbnb, et cetera. But we're not thinking about it in terms of like IT infrastructure a lot of the time. We're not thinking about like servers and access points. And we're not always talking about it from the lens of the employee experience either, but engaging the back-end team as much as the front-end team, that really matters in terms of creating a powerful experience, like Rich said. And so next slide, please. And so the takeaways here, again, and please, if you walk away with nothing else, this is all Rich and I want. Just engage us early, right? Engage cyber and CX early in the design phase. And that it doesn't have to be over-engineered, by the way. Like it can be, as large or, scaled as you need it to be. But co-create with those people who are in the ecosystem of the problem, right? In this case, deploying secure servers, like co-create with those people who are going to be touching it. And then pay as much attention as you do to the CX to the EX, the employee experience.
So before we go on, the two things that really stuck out to me, in addition to these, the employee experience is a critical part of customer experience. And in fact, many agencies even start with employee experience. And being a productive employee, as I mentioned earlier, is where you get the productivity and the morale and the engagement out of your employees. So that is really a critical part. And then the other thing is, we talked early on as well about security happens at all levels. And when you mentioned like even commercial brands, let's just say you're working with Amazon. If their back end, if there's a security issue on their back end, it blows up everything, right? So it really, any of these examples, Airbnb, any of them that you use in your daily lives. So it really does demonstrate the importance of how these things work together. Next slide. So now it's time to field some questions. We have a couple here. First question, you mentioned trust. Can you speak to how both areas of CX and security impact people's trust in government and government services? Amanda or Rich, do you all want to take that? I was ready to jump right in there.
How, I'm sorry, I'm reading it. Can you speak to how both areas? Absolutely. So, I mean, like you mentioned at the top of this, Martha, I think both are really important to trust. You mentioned that this is, the number one and number two objective in the president's management agenda. And that's for a reason, because people are people who are within the government in particular are very concerned about the level of trust that we as citizens have in our government. Because like Raza mentioned at the top of this as well, we have a lot of trust in brands, right? Like you mentioned Amazon. If there's a person here who is not using Amazon for their primary shopping, I know you're lying, right? Because we trust that. We might have thoughts about Jeff Bezos, but we trust that experience, right? And so we're trying to get to the same thing. And I think that for all the reasons outlined, CX and security are really, really critical to that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it has been shown that delivering government services efficiently and effectively and increases trust in government. But I want to make sure we get to two more questions that we have. One is there anything that CX and security teams can do to align before the project even starts? And I think, Rich, I'm going to ask you, like, what would you recommend to security people in agencies and how they should bring the CX people in? And then Amanda, we can go over to you and how will you work differently in the future to bring security into the conversation?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily bringing the CX people into the conversation as much as, collaborating with the other teams and because depending upon what you're doing. So I guess if we take it from the context of the first case study, bringing CX into that, it really wasn't bringing CX in, it was an outcome. Good customer experience was the outcome. So getting the team members to work collectively and collaboratively to address problems and concerns. So if, from this standpoint, if we're developing a new capability, a new system, and it's a great new widget that we're going to get to field, but bringing all those people up front and, instead of bringing them along 8 or 10 steps down the road, bringing them in early, making sure that they are partners in the process instead of just, somebody else that we're doing and we're working with, and, at some point in the project, or painfully where it happens too often is right before the project is fielded or the capability is fielded. Let's throw it over to security to see what they think. And then, then you've got that pushback. And I think the other piece of this is that if we're doing this right, we're not only coupling CX, but we're using, as we do at NuAxis, we use human-centered design to solve problems and solve it once instead of having to go back and look at the problem over and over and over again and really not solve it. Let's find out what's going on, and to use the old consulting term, peeling back the onion, and figure out what really the customer needs and how that's going to be impacted by security. What do we need to do to make sure it is secure? Do you need multi-factor authentication? Do you need a FIDO compliant product, a facial recognition tool, something like that that's going to make it more streamlined for the customer? But again, bringing everybody up front, it's got to be collaborative from the get-go. It can't be haphazardly done.
And when there's a pain point and somebody's having an issue and you start to peel back the onion and identify those pain points, that is bringing CX into it. Human-centered design is one of the major components of CX. It's a big part of it. I'm going to go with the last question and go over to Amanda on how do you convince leadership that customer experience is important to focus on for your organization?
Oh my gosh, this is where I have all my battle scars. This is what has aged me 10 years. But it's there's some best practices for this, but I think overall, where I've had success is asking for a pilot. Number one, starting to socialize this early and often, but getting a small pilot, that's a CX best practice anyway, but talking to a leader who, has positional authority within the organization, who may, have an aperture for thinking this way, finding that person or persons, asking to do a pilot within their organization, and then having the capacity to share out what the results are of that, what the process was that you went through, and then share out those results. That's a way, if you're, you know, more in doing this in a grassroots way, that's a way to sort of make your case, get your proof points, and then get the buy-in for it because you've demonstrated that it works.
Yeah, I also think that, first of all, you have to educate your leadership on what customer experience really is.
Yeah.
And what is the experience that your customers are having with the services that you provide in the organization. And then talk about what is the experience that you want to be providing. And then what does that lead to? Is that a technology issue? Is that policies and procedures that need to be changed? But having that vision, and once they buy in on a vision, then customer experience is the way to get there, and working with your technology teams. So I think with that, we are going to say thank you so much to Rich and Amanda and for sharing with us today their expertise and the case studies with NuAxis, and to Raza for his loyal support of customer experience across the government and within NuAxis. And thank you for allowing me to share this time with you and your lunch.
And thank you, Martha.